Welcome to Robert Bellissimo at the Movies. This is a YouTube video podcast where we explore storytelling on film, but in this case today, it's going to be about television for the first time, as well as interviews with industry professionals who work in various areas of the arts. I want to welcome to the show Stephen Bowie, who is a film and television historian with a Bachelor of Arts in Cinema and Television Studies from the University of Southern California. As a writer or archivist, he has worked for the New York Public Library, the Archive of American Television, BAM Cinematheque, and Getty Images. He was the archival researcher for the HBO documentary Casting By, which I love, by the way. And he is the founder and editor of his blog, classictvhistory.com, which since its inception in December 2007 has been cited by the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Maclean's, The Wrap, and other mainstream publications. Stephen, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
When did you begin to get interested in the classic television era?
So, when I was a little kid, and then it just kind of gradually turned into a profession and a specialty. I think, I was the kind of nerd who was watching The Outer Limits and the Andy Griffith Show and stuff, and transcribing the credits when I was a preteen. So that's kind of the starting point. Then I went to film school in Los Angeles at USC, and one of the things I stumbled across there was a video store fairly legendary video store that had a lot of bootleg VHS tapes of a lot of obscure and rare TV shows, including East Side, West Side. And that kind of opened a door because I thought, oh, all right, here's all this stuff that I read about, but I didn't know how to see it because it wasn't commercially available. And I had access to that. And then I started meeting some private collectors who had more. And, as a film student, I needed stuff to write about. And I was sort of looking for something to specialize in. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to be I don't need to be the 10 millionth person who's writing about Hitchcock or Kubrick, but here's this other thing that I really like that nobody seems to be writing about or doing any original research on. So I just kind of made that a priority. And in fact, East Side, West Side was something that I got like 2 or 3 undergraduate papers out of that because I was starting to do research on it. And the article you found, I eventually published while I was still an undergraduate. I did most of the research for that when I was about 20, 19 or 20. And finally, when our professor said, maybe give it a rest on East Side, West Side. Find another show. This is great, but maybe pick another one to write about next time. So I'm like, all right, okay, I get it. But,
so what was it about the show, the content of the show that you felt was worth writing about and exploring?
I mean, it just had heft to it that's rare, then and now. I mean, you can kind of instantly look at it and say, okay, this is really serious-minded, and it's political, and it's trying to push some buttons, and it's doing stuff that everybody's going to be resistant to, and you just like that kind of attitude. And the execution was certainly hit or miss, but because it had a very troubled production. But you look at the high points of that, and you're just blown away. It's just incredible drama. It's just, I mean, there are 5, 6, maybe 8 episodes of that show out of 26 that are just some of the best things that ran on American television in the early 60s. And also, I think, my pet theory that I always bring up in this regard is, people talk about golden ages of television, and they talk about the live television dramas of the 50s as being a high point, and then they talk about like the Norman Lear sitcoms of the 70s as being a high point, and then the serial dramas like Hill Street Blues of the 80s, and then the kind of Sopranos era of like adult and cable television. They point to those as the peaks of the golden ages, and I've always said, fine, but there's a period in the early 60s where a lot of that live television talent moved into filmed episodic weekly television, and they produced maybe a dozen and a half really first-rate mostly hour-long dramas, and a lot of those are forgotten or they're underrated and they're hard to see. And I've always stuck up for that as one of the great high points of American television history, and certainly the one that's least understood and least revisited. And East Side, West Side is really one of the key pieces in that puzzle. because it really pushed the envelope further than almost anything else on television until many, many years later.
Yeah, I mean, when I saw it a few years ago, I mean, I was shocked to think that this was, like you said, A, the early 60s, B, on CBS, where we're following these social workers and dealing with everything from racism to poverty to blockbusting. I mean, a lot of these issues, of course, I mean, this show holds up so well today. Homelessness, it's still so relevant. And
because we haven't fixed any of that. We haven't fixed any of that. We still got it all. It's just worse now. So
exactly. Yeah.
You're nostalgic for how easy, I mean, like how simple it seemed when George C. Scott was trying to solve it.
Yeah, I know it. It's incredible to me that this was on television then. So again, I loved your it's a great in-depth, detailed article that on your website about the making of this show, and I highly recommend anyone interested in the show, or if you've seen the show, or even if you haven't seen the show, to read it. And I just wanted to touch on some of the things you talked about. So can you talk a little bit about who initially got interested in this show about social workers?
So, I mean, one answer to that would be nobody. I mean, the show, it's like if they knew what they were buying, they never would have bought it. I mean, it kind of got through the back door because, because George C. Scott was the flavor of the month. He was obviously this hot new actor, won a lot of awards. He was in some big movies. He seemed destined for movie stardom, as he eventually achieved. And CBS managed to land a commitment to him for a series from him, which he typically would not have done. I mean, he's very critical of television for everything except for the, before and after the 5 minutes when he signed the contract, he was extremely critical of television. The only reason they got him was that he had started this kind of vanity project of a regional theater was in the Midwest, where he's from. I forget if it was Wisconsin,
Detroit, right? In Michigan?
Detroit. Yeah, right, yeah. Exactly. It's Detroit, yeah. Which was the part of the country he was from. And he wanted money. He needed money for that, and CBS understood that was the way to his heart. And so he said yes to this deal without really anybody thinking about what the show was going to be. CBS didn't care. They just, we got George C. Scott, great. We can sell that. And they offered him something really, they put something really traditional in front of him, like an action adventure type of show, I think. And he rejected that. He understood that would be lightweight and would bore the heck out of him. So somehow David Susskind, who was an independent producer, had been a talent agent, big wheeler dealer, kind of a celebrity himself, horned in on this. Somebody tipped him off that this was a situation that was in flux at CBS. So he horned in on it and said, "Okay, I can produce the show if I can get everybody to agree to something." And he went to a writer he'd worked with on some key projects in the 50s named Robert Alan Arthur, and Arthur was now an executive at remind me which one of the companies. Arthur was one
of the big TV.
Yes, was it Filmways, or I forgot. I got to reread the article. So Arthur wasn't even available, but he had this script in his bottom drawer that had never been produced that was about social workers. And Susskind got this script in front of Scott, and Scott kind of clicked and said, "Oh, okay, I can do something relevant." That's kind of the buzzword, was relevant. This can have some meat on the bones if we do it right. So Scott said yes to that, and then CBS, because they needed to make the thing work with Scott, they said yes to it without probably really thinking about what they were getting into.
Right.
And also, to be fair, certainly the pilot that was produced off of that Robert Alan Arthur script was much more conventional than the show became. I mean, it wasn't a total whitewash. It wasn't that soft. But it was a little West Side Story-ish, in its subject matter, which was similar to, I think, to West Side Story. It was about ethnic Latino gangs in New York City. So the pilot maybe, which was mediocre, maybe did not raise the red flags that it would have been if they'd filmed like who do you kill first. It
Right.
needed a little work, but on the strength of Scott, it got on the air, and it got on the air late. So they rushed into production with no scripts, no key production personnel in place, and no real idea how to produce an hour-long show on film, because Susskind's company was very independent. I mean, it was well connected, but it was entirely independent of any studio, big studio, or at least at the outset of the series, of any big studio or the network. And they produced weekly live television, and they had produced a lot of prestigious videotape one-offs, like Play of the Week. So they were used to working with big stars. They were not used to something on the scale of what East Side, West Side would become. So it was this kind of, it was a fast-moving train with a lot of big personalities and conflicts headed its way.
I couldn't help but laugh when you talked about the smiling cobra there. Why is his name escaping me now?
James Aubrey.
Yeah,
James
yeah,
T.
Aubrey.
Yeah.
I was recently read about him because I read a book on the making of Ryan's Daughter from 1970, and of course he, as I'm sure as you know, he later took over MGM and also just was like slashing budgets and canceling.
Literally dismantled it. Literally sold it for scrap.
Yeah. A guy
notorious.
Right, and I couldn't help but laugh, because I thought, well, how, everything I had read about him, I thought, how did he get behind this show? But as you said, it wasn't so much that.
And he was Aubrey was an all-around scumbag. I mean, I kind of adopted the smiling cobra as my Twitter handle.
I noticed that, yeah.
It's kind of a tossed-off joke, but I did that before Me Too, and Aubrey, of course, had that same kind of reputation as having some really inappropriate sexual behavior as part of his career. So probably
I was reading about that.
I would cringe it. I kind of cringe. I'm stuck with it now, but I kind of cringe at that because that makes the legend of what a slimebag he was a little bit less entertaining and funny in retrospect now, I think. But
right.
But yeah, Aubrey was really this avatar of extremely cynical escapist television, and because of him, you had this East Side West Side entered CBS in this really uniquely schizoid environment where you had the most envelope pushing in terms of like how just really dumbed down and sexualized and lowbrow primetime programming could be. I mean, Aubrey was really on the cutting edge of that. He put on the air, he put Gilligan's Island on the air, he put the Beverly Hillbillies on the air. He put, he tried to sex up shows like Route 66, he put My Living Doll on the air with Julie Newmar, which was an extremely sexualized show. And the rumor was always that, she was his girlfriend, and the show got on the air. I don't know if that's true or not, but that was the rumor at the time. And then at the same time, you had the old guard, which was William Paley, who was running CBS. You had executives like Hubbell Robinson had finally been pushed out by Aubrey, but Robinson and Michael Dand, who kind of came out of this period in the very early days of television, where television was seen as potentially being something of a public utility and having a public service component that it was meant to meant to provide, in part because they wanted to regulate themselves rather than have the government regulate them. And there was that threat that, the FCC could yank your license if you put something too sleazy or bad on the air. So they wanted to mollify that. And also, these were New York society guys. They wanted to be able to hang out with their bankers and their corporate friends in their country club and not have to defend, the Beverly Hillbillies. They wanted to have, these guys wanted to have something on it sounds naive now because I don't think it's really the case anymore, but they wanted to be able to have things on CBS that they could point to and say, all right, we got to have Gilligan's Island on there to pay the bills. But we also have Playhouse 90, or we have the Defenders, we have this other, we're doing serious work and we're contributing to the social good and we're respectable and all of that. And East Side, West Side, I think, came along in that tradition of kind of getting in through the cracks in that slot. And also, in 2 seasons before East Side West Side launched, they had done The Defenders, which was similar in some ways and very different in other ways, but it also tackled, after some growing pains, it started tackling issues like abortion and just a laundry list of controversial social and political issues, and doing it in a fairly unflinching way. And it did that with the network's support, and it actually became a modest hit. So that was a real success story for CBS for trying to do this kind of television that tackled politics in a way that was serious-minded, and not pandering, and getting away with it. So they probably felt like maybe they could pull that off a second time with East Side West Side, and they just spectacularly did not. All the things that landed on them that you would predict, that they got away, that they managed to elude on The Defenders, it just crushed East West Side.
So did Aubrey basically go with it because he felt that he had to have something prestigious, because that was sort of the CBS's reputation, like there had to be some kind of a balance? Do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I think he was against it, and certainly, and he did seek to undermine it once it got on. I just think they went over his head. I mean, because he was the president of CBS, but he was not the chairman of the board of CBS. So I just think it was one of those battles that he either lost or he didn't fight. He didn't choose to fight because he was winning, the majority of them elsewhere. But he succeeded in undermining it in a variety of ways. And I mean, the ratings are the ultimate arbiter. If it had been a huge hit, then it would have stayed on. But he certainly had some success in kneecapping it in ways that we'll probably get into.
Yeah. Well, I love the story of when he called in George C. Scott and David Susskind, and he said, because George C. Scott, as it's well known, his temper was, violent temper at times, and he kept slicing his apple and not even talking, as Aubrey was saying, all the ways that they have to clean the show up, and then all of a sudden he just put his knife in the table and said, "We're not changing anything."
Yeah,
that's such a great story.
Those two, yeah, his Susskind's son is the one who told me that, and I could tell that he had been dining out on that for years, and I suspect his dad had been as well, as kind of their go-to East Side West Side story. Yeah, it's just the clash. I mean, they're both extreme personality types, and I don't know that they would have been in the room together all that often, but when they were, it would have been Aubrey as the ultimate, like, insubstantial, opportunistic network hack, the ultimate Mad Men type suit, and Scott as the ultimate, temperamental, inconsistent, egotistical, unrealistic, creative person. And with Susskind sort of in the middle, sort of probably telling both sides what they wanted to hear. So it really is just a classic, clash of these really intense and sort of archetypal television personalities.
There's some
scenes.
Right. So I was wondering if you wouldn't happen to know, because I know that George C. Scott had final say about which scripts would go. Like he had a lot of power, and there, as you said, there's about 8 episodes that are some of the best in television history, and I would agree. But then there's a lot of mediocre ones or bad ones in there. I know that you mentioned some of them he hated. Why did he go with some of those episodes, or was it just that there was nothing else?
No, yeah, they had to film. They had to film whatever.
Yeah.
At a certain point, they had to film whatever they had in front of them. I mean, they did buy a lot of stuff that they threw out. I mean, 2 things. One, I mean, Scott had veto power. He could and did on several occasions very conspicuously walk off the set. I mean, there's an episode where they just stick a clone of that character in. They just drop him. They just parachute him into that script, where this actor, James Patterson, is playing a character who is clearly a substitute for Scott's character. and it's really just sort of shocking that it's kind of shockingly unprofessional that it got to that point. I mean, there are a lot of actors who threatened to walk to not come out of their trailer, but Scott actually did it, and they shot it with some other guy, and they
Oh my
put it on
God.
the air. I mean, hard to think of other examples of having to make
I
that kind of stuff.
yeah.
There are some, like Name of the Game did that when Tony Franciosa was not behaving. I mean, like all of a sudden it's Robert Culp that week or Robert Wagner that week, and there's no real explanation as to nearly identical. So it's not unique, but Scott, but that's kind of, Scott, he could say no, but the extent to which he could influence, he couldn't sit down and bang out a script on his typewriter that was good himself. So, he had power, but he didn't have control in that sense. And I also think, I mean, tracing Scott through this process was one of the more interesting challenges of researching this show, because I think he was mercurial and he contradicted himself a lot. And I think there's probably a point where he kind of, I mean, first of all, he had ideas that were really good and ideas that were really bad. And it was difficult, and he was a freight train. So it was a question of like, people like Susskind and some of the other producers on the show would have been in a position of trying to fight for the ideas that really were good or were realistic enough to get on the air, and somehow trying to dissuade him from the other ones. Like supposedly one person remembered that, he wanted to marry Cicely, Tyson's character, which would have, I mean, how would you have tried? I mean, that's totally unrealistic. But I mean, and one of the things about doing this research in 1996 was that I got him on the phone. I got George Scott on the phone myself, which was just an amazing thing for an undergraduate. And I was just completely starstruck. And he was pretty ill at that point, and he didn't remember a lot. And he kind of I mean, I read back some of his quotes from TV Guide when he was really fiery and mad about it being canceled at the time. And he kind of, he seemed a little embarrassed about it. He kind of, anytime I threw some of the really fiery stuff from the 60s, he kind of, talked it down. He kind of, de-escalated it a little bit, and so he mellowed, I think, was what I'm saying.
Right. What was he? What was? Sorry, go ahead.
And he had a serious drinking problem at the time,
right.
And he may have been, wanting to distance himself from that too. I don't know. I mean, I think that was on and off for his whole life, but
yeah.
So I think, I mean, he fought. I really think it was kind of. It was kind of a thing where he fought and he fought and he fought and he fought. And then at a certain point, it was clear that he was losing, and he just kind of threw up his hands and became petulant about it, and maybe even self-destructive, and undermined some of the things that would have been good for the show. And it's hard to blame him, because they really did kind of pull the rug out from under him on it. And at a certain point, that like as soon as the ratings came in and it was clear it wasn't going to compete with Sing Along with Mitch, then the network stopped backing it, even to the extent that they had, and just threw it under the bus, sent him under the bus. And you can't really, be mad at him necessarily. I wouldn't have wanted to work with him on it, but there's that famous story where when they were filming the last episode, he got drunk, and there's a scene where his character punched. I don't even think that's in the script. I mean,
you mentioned that was improvised.
Yeah, I mean, he had a scene where he had a big rant in this restaurant, and supposedly Scott actually punched an actual mirror, and you see him bleeding, and he's actually the cut you see is a real cut, and it's real blood that you see on the mirror and on his fist. That wouldn't surprise me if that's really true.
That's such an incredible ending, and as you said in the piece, it was that episode was almost like a sneak peek of what was actually happening behind the scenes, because that whole episode he's trying to get these articles out about poor people, and no one wants to read it, and so in frustration he breaks a mirror, and that's very much what was happening. No one wants to the network saying no one wants to see a show about these realities, right? And obviously that was driving him insane.
I mean, in a way, that's one of the great finales. It's not totally successful creatively, but it's East Side West Side was definitely a show where they knew they were getting canceled, and they had time to write a finale. And the finale was this really elaborate analogy for their own cancellation. It's this incredibly self-referential piece, and it's very bitter, and it's inside. You could watch it and not even realize the extent to which it's this fuck you to CBS for for stabbing him in the back, but it very much is that, and it in a way it's a good note. It's a great, see, it's the perfect note for this show to
Oh, absolutely.
grow out,
Yeah.
to grow out at this middle finger at the powers that be that rendered them ineffectual, and took away even a little bit of good that they were trying to do, which is very much what the show was about in its heyday. It was very conscious of the fact that however well intentioned they are, George C. Scott's character and his colleagues, the best they can do is a drop in the bucket. It's a lot of, and particularly the extent to which that Scott, I think one of the weaker, as an example of one of the ideas that Scott had that maybe was not so great for the show, is that he was very comfortable speechifying. So if you wrote a really meaty, 10-minute harangue for Scott's character to deliver, he would jump on that, and he would act the hell out of it, even if it kind of stopped the drama dead, which there are a few episodes for that kind of come to that point. But but in a way, that's it's just kind of shaking your fist at those problems instead of solutions. And East Side West Side was very realistic about how that's how things work out most of the time. So.
Right. Yeah, he's not. He's doing his best, and he's a good person, and he's compassionate, but a lot of the times he can't solve a lot of these problems because there's just there's way too much corruption or racism, or the system getting in the way. What was he like personally, just to talk to him? So you talked to him on the phone?
Oh, Scott, yeah, it was just a phone thing.
Okay.
The funny thing is, I was prepared, but I've never had this happen before or since. I sent him a letter. I got his address and I sent him a letter, on like a Tuesday afternoon. And I swear to God, he called me at 9 a.m. the next morning. I didn't even know mail could be delivered that fast. He must have gone out to his mailbox literally the next. We were both in LA, but still, I assumed I had a day or two to finish preparing. So I was sort of prepared, but he calls me, and my, I'm in college. I'm an undergraduate, and I have a college roommate that I barely know. And this guy comes in at like 9 the next morning and says, "Hey, there's a George Scott on the phone for you." And I literally am halfway through saying, "I don't know anybody named George Scott." Holy shit! This roommate is an aspiring actor, and I said, "That's George C. Scott."
Oh my
and we
God.
both just stare at each other for a minute with our mouths hanging open. And then I dive for the phone and I talk to him for what is only ultimately very unremarkable 10-minute conversation. And I was prepared enough to get through it, but and it probably wouldn't have helped even if I was able to nerd out even further, because he was very polite, but it was anticlimactic because it was hard getting him to really engage.
Right.
And I also think I think if you're someone who struggles with alcohol as epically as he did throughout his career, maybe the retention is not there in terms of the memory of the minutiae. So the more useful source in terms of Scott were the contemporary interviews where he gave and kind of railed at CBS for all the legitimate grievances he had. And that's mostly what I quote. There were more quotes in that piece than I remembered that I actually got myself, but the most useful stuff from him, not from the other sources, was stuff he gave it. He spoke about at the time. And going back to the downbeat aspect of it, the unhappy endings. I will say that's another thing that they were able to copy from The Defenders, because The Defenders was a show where the lawyers would lose cases. They lost their cases all the time. They're like the worst lawyers in the world because the show was realistic about that, and that they were fighting these social issues. And the lawyers on The Defenders, they would have a client, like in the abortion episode. The guy's like, "Put me on trial. I want to make the case for legalizing abortion." And the lawyers are like, "Well, we can do that, but you're going to jail. You can use the courtroom as your soapbox, but the jury's not going to let you off." So the show was realistic about that. And East Side, West Side at its best was also very realistic about how insurmountable these problems the social workers are pursuing are. And I make that point because I love to look at TV shows from this period that are 50, 60, 70 years old now, and point out things that would be difficult or impossible to do now, because people look at TV as this linear thing, particularly after The Sopranos. They're like, "Oh, TV is just getting more adult and more sophisticated." And I'm like, that's true in some ways, but not true in others, because I'm like, could you put a show that downbeat week
Mm,
to week on the air now. I feel
yeah,
like that would be a hard sell now.
I think it would be.
Tell me a contemporary example where somebody where you have a scripted show where a character talks about the politics of the moment and real specifics,
Right.
and takes really commits to ideas that are going to be unpopular with some of the audience, and
Hmm.
knowingly doing that, and really being in your face and button pushing in the way that East Side West does. The last show that I can think of that did that was probably Boston Legal.
Mm,
And again,
mm,
it had some of the same, some of the same aesthetic defaults where, maybe James Spader making a 10-minute speech in the last act every week is not the most dramatically exciting or sophisticated thing. But I love that show for that, because I felt like that was rare and hard to do. And you really had to have a mulish insistence on kind of rubbing people's noses and things that are actually going on around them, and not
right.
just taking the escapist route, or at least, you know, the thing that TV can do is that it can bring up those issues and it can acknowledge that they exist, but then it can't resist putting a band-aid on it at
Right.
the end of the
Right.
hour, of saying, well, all right, yeah, racism sucks, but we're going to give our characters a win this week because we
Right.
want you to leave. We want you to tune in again.
Of
That's
course.
very much an impulse, and even in TV shows that you would think um, would avoid it. I guess The Wire, did not cop out in a lot of ways. I mean,
Right.
that's another show that's a clear successor to East Side West Side, but they're very, very rare.
Right.
And you know, good luck, good luck selling Who Do You Kill to somebody. Good luck getting somebody to give you money to make that today.
Yeah. Well, I've been meaning to watch The Defenders as well, because that sounds like a really, really good show. I haven't seen it. Who would you say were the people who contributed the most to the show? Because there was a lot of like great, openly left wing blacklisted writers coming back,
Yep.
post the
Yep.
blacklisting period here. Who do you think contributed the most?
So I mean, the show had a tremendous creative turnover. I mean, they went through, I think, probably three what you would today call showrunners, although that term didn't exist at the time,
Right.
in the space of a single season. And I think even with those three, there were probably sort of fallow periods where there was no one at the wheel. The person I would really single out as making the most valuable creative contribution to the show was Arnold Pearl.
Right. Yeah. That's
Um,
what I thought you'd
he
say.
was, yeah, I mean, he was a blacklisted writer. He had been a radio dramatist. That was really where he had been most successful, and then moved into live television, but was prevented from having a major career there by politics, by the blacklist. And then during the production of East Side West Side, he had a heart attack. He had to quit.
Mm,
Um,
mm.
I mean, George, I mean, you can say I'm being a little bit glib, but like I think literally, I mean, there was apparently a physical confrontation. So you can say that George C. Scott put him in the hospital and off the show, which is
Mm.
unfortunate because the show was that period of, I don't know, 6 or 8 episodes that Pearl produced and commissioned and possibly rewrote is definitely the strongest
Yeah.
section of East Side West Side. And then he worked a little bit after East Side West Side, but he did have a weak heart and he did die fairly young. He died in 1971, so he did not have a major career after it. Although he wrote a script about Malcolm X that
Right.
eventually morphed into the Spike Lee. So he ended up having an Oscar nomination for a script that was like posthumous by 2.5 decades,
Yeah.
which
I
is,
didn't. I didn't know that until, because I've always loved that film. I didn't know that till I read your article.
yeah. I think I imagine it diverged a lot from his material, but I don't know. I haven't read the script,
Yeah.
but Pearl was the guy uh, who made Who Do You Kill happen, and he brought in some other Millard Lampell and some other really talented people that he had in his back pocket. He got Ossie Davis, the actor, to write an episode. It
Right.
was pretty good. Making Davis certainly one of a very small handful of people of color who had a
Mm.
primetime screenwriting credits at that time. Uh, so Pearl, yeah, I mean, his episodes are just great. That's really the peak of that. And he did not pull any punches. I mean, the shows that don't cop out are the ones that you just wish. I mean, probably the show wouldn't have survived beyond a season anyway. But I think if Pearl had been able to stay to remain on it in creative control, that back 9 or whatever would be much stronger than we got, and you could really make a case for it. It's just this incredible creative thing. I mean, it's pretty good. It's it's overall, I think it's a good show, and even the shows that don't, the episodes that don't really succeed are worth a look. But I would love to have seen it. Producing a full 26,
Well, and he also brought on other writers who contributed, because he also brought Alan E. Sloan, right?
I think so. I think Sloan
Yeah,
is his.
and he did, No Wings at All, which was the one about the it was autism, I believe, the family with the autistic son. That was a really, really good one. And there was another fight there with George C. Scott and that writer, right?
And yeah, and that's a good example of Scott seeming just sort of bafflingly, if the stories that I collected are to be believed, and of course their memories differ, but Scott certainly comes across as the villain in that, where he felt like he knew that, and this certainly is true of Scott. He certainly seemed to feel like he knew everything about everything, and was the ultimate expert on whatever you would throw in front of him, and
right.
Apparently he was critical of the script without realizing that the writer of it was someone who really had a child, who actually had a child with a similar disability, and when that came out, he didn't back down, and it was a really ugly confrontation that made Scott look kind of bad. Although again, we don't have Scott's side of the story; we only have the writer who managed to deeply offend. But there are other stories too where Scott just sort of seems to have. Sloan in particular is critical of Scott. I mean, Sloan said that he had pitched a story about a Malcolm X figure who essentially called a general strike in Harlem, and Scott and he had pitched that as a final episode, which would have been incredible and really would have. I mean, it's hard to think of anything that could have gone even further politically than who do you kill?
Who do you kill? Yeah.
But that would have done it. And Scott, you don't, and Scott, and Sloan said that it was Scott who shot it down. Who wasn't?
Yeah, I was surprised.
That. I don't understand. Yeah, I don't understand. Because again, I couldn't. I wasn't able to ask. We don't know how Scott or anyone else would have remembered that encounter. It seems out of character, and it may not be true. That may not be a fair depiction of where Scott fell on that or whatever, but I do think, there's a self-destructive aspect of Scott's behavior in all of these stories throughout the show. So you can just sort of say, you know what, they don't deserve it. Forget it. I give up. I'm out. I'm not fighting for this stuff anymore. Do what you want. So I don't know, but yeah, going back to Pearl, I think he was just. It was just a great marriage of a writer and the right material, and for the limited period when he was on it, he just made the absolute best of it.
Yeah. Well, just a note on Scott. I mean, he's so good as Brock. Like, it's hard to believe. Like when you read these behind the scenes stories, I mean, it's hard to believe that the guy who was, had this violent temper was this compassionate, generous. I mean, he was tough in the show too, but a really good person. But then at the same time, when you look at him in movies, he's also convincing when he's ruthless, like in The Hustler and Anatomy of a Murder. He's just a great actor. I mean, he's just one of the all-time. He could just do. He could do so much. But yeah, the other was Millard Lampell, No Hiding Place, the blockbusting. That was another great one. I believe Pearl brought him as well, right? He was someone Pearl brought. Yeah,
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
those three had overlapped on a lot of radio and early television things. I mean, I think you see their names not collaborating, but working for the same producers on the same radio and live dramas. So I think they would have all known each other from that. Although, as far as I can tell, because Sloan ultimately, somewhat late in the game, named names, and the other two did not. I think obviously Pearl forgave him because he hired him, but supposedly Lampell, I read some. Lampell was interviewed about. Lampell, I couldn't find him when I was doing the research on this, and then he died before I went back and revised it. So I never talked to Lampell. There was one person, Lampell or John Barry, the director, who was also blacklisted. would have loved to talk to them to both of them. But Lempel did give interviews about his blacklist experience, and since Sloan was one of the people who named, or was the person who named him for the committee, he was critical of Sloan to the end of his life. Apparently, they may or may not have reconciled, but certainly they were both working for Pearl independently on East Side, West Side, and
Mm-hmm.
having fallen ultimately made the opposite decisions on the blacklist. So that's how that
Right.
worked. And East Side, West Side, and I think this was just probably more Pearl than anybody else. Brought a whole lot of actors back, a whole lot of actors who had not worked in television for many years because they were blacklisted. You look at their first credit back is on East Side, West Side. I mean, the Defenders did it some too, but not to the same extent as East Side, West Side did.
Well, they're the cast. I mean, you also see a lot of actors, just before they began to blow up in
Yep.
film, like Gene Hackman is in it. Alan Arkin, Martin Sheen. It's you see a lot of actors who later became, these were like some of their early parts.
Any of those New York shows from the 60s are like that. I mean, it's just this incredible thing.
And Naked City's like that too. You see these same actors
like that.
Yeah.
NYPD is amazing. And NYPD, although it doesn't really have a lot of political content, in terms of the look of it, and a lot of the writers like Eddie Adler showed up a few years later. And that was a Susskind production too. NYPD. It was a half-hour cop
show. I
didn't
know that.
Late 60s. Yeah. Half-hour cop show from the late 60s. Ran for 2 seasons. It's okay creatively, but it's not that exciting. But like East Side, West Side, it's all out in the streets. And it also has all of these, and because it's much closer to the 70s, you get Al Pacino, you get Jill Clayburgh, you get all these actors who were huge stars in the 70s, and they have like one TV credit, and it's NYPD. You see that with these early 60s shows too, with the earlier generation, like Dustin Hoffman on The Defenders, and the ones you get on East Side, West Side. And it's this tremendous time capsule value that they didn't know they were creating at the time, but now you have it. You don't quite have the same thing. You have good actors in the Los Angeles produced shows at the time, but you don't have those theater actors at the beginning of their career like you do on the New York shows. And it's just incredible to look at them. And it's like the only place you can see them, because they might have done some live TV too, but that's not really, it doesn't really exist. It might be lost. So you have these handful of shows where they get captured in amber when they're like 23 or whatever. And it's this amazing document.
It's sorry, go ahead.
No.
I was just going to mention some of the other collaborators, because just talking about the look of the show. I mean, it certainly had, they were shooting, on the streets. It had a real gritty documentary, utilizing a documentary look. I mean, and one of the DOPs, Arthur Ornitz, again, went on to do some of the greatest films, ever made in America. You've got Serpico, The Boys in the Band, Cassavetes, Minnie and Moskowitz, An Unmarried Woman, Next Stop Greenwich Village. I mean, a lot of these are some of the great New York films as well. And even the composer, I mean, that's such a great score, Kenyon Hopkins, and he did the Hustler, Baby Doll. I mean, I love the score in that intro in this. It's a phenomenal.
Look, every time I look at the names in the credits, way down in the credits of that show, I mean, it's amazing how deep that talent was. I mean, like Sidney Myers, who was the primary editor on it, was an important avant-garde filmmaker. Alan Heim, who was the sound editor, was a huge film editor in the 70s and 80s. He edited All That Jazz. He edited Network.
Oh, yeah.
And he was the sound guy buried in the credits of this.
He's still alive.
You should get him.
I know someone who's good friends with him. Yeah. I didn't know he worked on this.
He worked on this show when he was in his 20s. Yeah. And just like, I can point to a dozen other names in the credits like that, of like Pete Hamill, who was a famous newspaper columnist, was like their technical, like their technical advisor for a short period. And all these names that I didn't even know who the hell they were when I was researching this when I was in my 20s. And then I go back, because when I launched my website in the late 2007, I revised that piece. I went back and looked at it. Oh my God, there are all these other names in here who were huge to me, and I was dimly aware of them, who they were at the time. And you find that in the cast list too. Like Larry Eric Larry Eric, who was the final producer on the show, who was kind of keeping the lights on, he was a really junior guy who had been like an improv guy for Second City.
Right.
So you look at the credit, you look at all the bit parts in the show once he started producing it, and it's all these sort of forgotten Second City comedians doing little bit parts in the show. And you get like Barbara Harris in there, who would come out of Second City, So
yes,
that's this weird, this kind of conduit of Second City people who turn up in it later on, and so. Yeah, it's almost like a code to break, all these different influences of New York, the New York creative world, the filmmaking world, the theater world, the avant-garde world are kind of popping up in little mainstream jobs on East Side, West Side. So again, this tremendous time capsule that goes very deep.
Yeah, no. I mean, and I'm not surprised, because when I was first watching this show, I'm like, oh, it reminds me of like the gritty 70s films. And then you look at all the people, so many of them
it's the people
worked
who
on this.
and you mentioned Arthur Ornitz, who shot the pilot. And he was an old time New York guy, but
yes,
Jack Priestley was the primary DP, and he shot Naked City and did not have a major feature career, but he shot, some key New York City movies like Across 110th Street.
Oh, that's a great one.
Born to Win, so not as important a feature cinematographer as he went back into television as I would have expected, honestly. But
right.
Just the top guy you could get for shooting on film in New York City. And one thing, I mean, that was so hard. I mean, they were doing 14-hour days on the streets in Harlem.
Yeah.
And Naked City was even. I mean, Naked City, because they didn't have the scripts. I mean, Naked City didn't have the scripts either, so they do 24-hour shooting days on Naked City.
Right.
I mean, they'd be shooting on Naked City till 5 a.m. and then the director and the cast from that episode would be slinking off to go to sleep, while the set for the next episode would be setting up.
Oh my God, yeah.
That's how out of control, how much of a runaway production that was. And East Side, West Side was a runaway. And the dirty little secret of The Defenders is that it was all talk. It's great talk, but it's all talk. It's a courtroom show. It was almost all interiors. I mean, Herbert Brodkin, the independent producer who shot that, was notoriously cheap and probably pocketed a lot of the production budget because they shot it all on sets. They're like, well, we're not going outside. That's too freaking hard. No thanks. But East Side, West Side went out there and they shot a whole lot of it on the street. So again, it's this time capsule, much like Naked City and NYPD, and you really see what. Again, The Defenders is one of the most articulate shows in the history of television, and East Side West Side has some speeches too. But you actually see what they're talking about. They're trying to actually show you the poverty, and they're showing you people of color. In contexts that people of color had not been on television before.
Right.
I mean, Cicely Tyson famously had an afro, which is like, there were no women in primetime who had an afro, which is ridiculous, but it was true. And so that was a big deal in the press. And that I think was one of the things. I think if you read between the lines and some of the quotes that I got from people who worked on the show, that was the real deal breaker for CBS, was that, like, on The Defenders, they could talk about all these hot button issues, but like you go on East Side, West Side, and there are Black people and there are brown people on the screen for a lot, that just freaked him out, that pushed buttons, that got angry letters from the South, that probably not as many as, people myth making, would say, but that really flipped their switch, I think. I mean, that was something that could not stand.
Right.
That was a much harder thing to duck for cover on, that really took balls, I think, to really, and it was important, it was worth doing, I just think. Oh,
definitely.
Those things look so different from even some of the other really smart television, like Naked City. I mean, Naked City, they had 1 or 2 episodes with prominent Black guest stars, but they didn't push that, that boundary. And it just seems so important to me in terms of representation to put that out there and to have, mostly positive depictions of people of color and of poor people, but unflinching, not whitewashing it.
Right.
I mean, because TV's thing in the early 60s in the Kennedy era and the civil rights era was like, all right, we're going to start to open this door. But when you see a black person on television, it's going to be Sidney Poitier, or it's going to be
Right.
Julia. It's going to
Right.
be a yuppie.
Right.
It's going to be someone you can take home to your mom. And it's going to be someone that, white liberals are not going to be, set off by. Which is better than nothing, or better than like, Beulah type stereotypes. I'm not saying that's not a kind of progress, but it's a limited kind. It's an unthreatening kind of progress.
Right. Right.
And
Right.
it's great if you're hiring really talented actors and giving them jobs, but if they're always playing the doctor or the lawyer, it's not really the center of the drama. That was kind of the place where television was in the early 60s. It was
Right.
like you're getting people of color on the screen, but you had this kind of narrow range of kind of professional roles that were open to them, and but they were not at the center of they were not playing the character like James Earl Jones plays. And
yes, and who do you kill?
who's the true protagonist, and the maybe not the not a wholly idealized or perfect representation.
Right.
And Eastside was way ahead
Oh yeah.
of anything else in that regard, and it only got to do it a few times, it didn't get to do it every episode. And
Right.
and you can really look at it and see Cicely Tyson's character as a battleground. It's like they're cagey about whether she's a secretary or whether she's a peer to George C.
Right.
Scott's character. I mean, they try to have it both ways. They go back and forth. I mean, I think at the end of the series, they clearly fired. I mean, Elizabeth Wilson, who played the white lady's
Yes.
worker. They fired her when they changed the format, which I think we'll talk about in a minute. But Cicely Tyson's status is a little bit ambiguous. Like, she comes back, she's still the social worker. She doesn't follow George C. Scott into the politics, and they try to deal with that. And I think they were trying to keep her in play, but they couldn't quite figure out how. And so it's like they kind of got halfway there with her character. It's like, you couldn't have a show where her character was the protagonist, where she was playing George C. Scott. That would have been cool.
Right.
Them trying to get as close as they could. They saw the value of trying to insist on her as a professional career woman.
Yes.
Was black and not really, brown, black and proud. Proud. So that's a really important thing.
So I know you touched on, you talked about how the show got canceled, and it's a combination of the ratings and the angry letters from the South over Cicely Tyson, being an equal to George C. Scott and Elizabeth Wilson. So do you, I know it's a combination of things. Like, what? So do you think it was also because the show just wasn't as good anymore once the George C. Scott character went into politics?
It was a lame duck show by the time they changed the format. Actually,
right? Yeah, because that's when it kind of went downhill.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, I think the answer is, the expression, "It's the economy, stupid," in politics. I mean, it's that way with TV. If this had been a runaway success out of the gate, they would have figured out how to keep it on. They would have been fighting over it every week, but they wouldn't have thrown it out if it was a hit. I mean, the number of actual hits that got canceled for some arcane reason, some external non-commercial reason, very rare. And I just think it was a show that they would have fought, that everyone would have fought for if it was it would have stayed on if it was a hit, and they would have fought to keep it, to allow it to keep some integrity.
Right.
And it probably would have been, some successes, some losses, like The Defenders was. But because it was such a big ask, because it was such a high maintenance thing in terms of dealing with the press, dealing with the sponsors, as soon as the ratings came in, it was getting creamed. They're like, forget it.
Right.
Just get rid of it. Just get rid of it as soon as you can. Let it limp along to the end. But once it was vulnerable, they really eviscerated it. They just gutted it creatively. Really, I almost admire the skill with which they cut out the parts of it that really pushed the envelope, because it sounds like on paper, George C. Scott is going to go be a politician, and so now he's going to have more power, and you're going to fight these battles at a higher level. I mean, that might sound good, and maybe they talked them. Some of the creative people may have talked themselves into believing it. But what they actually did was they got it off the streets.
Right.
They made it all about white dudes. They got rid of the women. They got rid of the people of color. They got rid of the slums. They got rid of everything visual that was controversial. And they made it a bunch of white guys in suits sitting around jerking each other off.
Yeah. And it wasn't nearly as interesting. And as you said, even though they had conflict and amongst each other, they all had the same goal.
They kept that fig leaf of being about current issues, but they didn't really represent those issues. They didn't really bring them home. They literally did not depict them. And yet on the surface, they kept it. It was about the same kind of stuff, and you look at those scripts where Scott is kind of selling out to join this congressman staff.
Yes.
It's like the writers are hashing it out. It's like they're trying to convince themselves in those dialogues between Scott and the kind of antagonist, the kind of slick PR guy played by John McMartin, who's another huge stage actor who was unknown then, but and Linden Chiles is the congressman who was sort of based on Kennedy and sort of based on John Lancey, the mayor of New York, who was young and charismatic. But all those dialogues are, it's like Scott is trying to convince himself that he's not selling out and he's losing. It's like he can't even convince himself. It's really interesting to watch the flop sweat in those. They're not entertaining. They're very dry and hard to get through. But
no, they really are.
As an instance of a show kind of eating itself alive, they're very revealing because it's all there in the material,
Mm-hmm.
It's like the material is working out this idea of, oh God, how are we selling out? We really are. Oh boy, this is worse than we thought. It's like, it's unfortunate. It's really unfortunate to see East Side, West Side collapse creatively after so cold out of the gate.
Right. Well, one of the episodes that we talked about talking about a couple of episodes, and I know we've already touched on many, but the one that you were talking about is Nothing But the Half Truth, which is a pretty good one, even though now we're Cicely Tyson is in it, and now he's working in politics, and he's we're not on the streets anymore. It's still a pretty good one, but the ending is so strange because he has so much conflict with these guys, and then all of a sudden he looks like he's going to quit. And then they just make this. The last scene is just. I watched the last scene again like a couple of times. I'm like, what exactly do they like? Where like they seem to just be like, okay, we're gonna keep going, and that's it. Right. Like it just seemed very.
It's
forced.
No, one thing I will say about that. I looked at it again last night too, and one thing I would say, the other thing that's kind of interesting about that last run of episodes is that they're trying to figure out how to tell a serialized story, which is really unusual in television at that time, in weekly television dramas, very rare. And this is one of those nascent efforts to do it, where like those back 6 or 7 episodes where he starts dealing with the congressman, it is a progression where Scott moves toward getting out of the social work and into politics. And one of my sources on it said that the plan was, if they got renewed, was that Scott would actually run for office.
Right.
They would have continued that arc. They would have continued doing story arcs, which is kind of interesting. I don't think it works.
Right. No.
And the reason it doesn't work is because they're not being true to the character. The character that they set up with Scott is this guy who he cares about the people, not the principles. He just wants to help people.
Right.
He wants those those tangible wins. That's what he's fighting for in that episode we're talking about. He's like, can we just help this one family that that I met and interviewed and fix their problems and not make them a political football?
Right.
And the people he's working for they can't even understand, they can't even process what that means, which is an intelligent idea. And I feel like the dialogue in it is particularly that last that penultimate scene where the congressman reads in the Riot Act and says, look, this is what you did right and what I approve of as a progressive. And this is the thing that you fucked up and I have to get out, I have to undo because it's politically unrealistic and you didn't understand that.
Right.
And you kind of see, even though he's a suit, you kind of see, well, all right, I see the point. I don't necessarily this is why I hate politicians. But okay, he's making the case for why this is the only way it's going to work
Right.
in this particular instance. That's a really interesting and nuanced scene. It's just
Yes.
not what East Side
Yes.
West Side's told you it was going to do, and it's a lot easier to do
Right.
than going out and saying, "Oh, okay, we're going to spend an hour with a black man who loses his shit because a rat ate his baby." You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
those are different levels of commitment.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
you know, and you know, nothing but the half truth is good for what it is. But it, you know, the point I was making was that it's just not true to Scott's character. It's
Exactly.
forcing him
Yeah.
into these boardrooms.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the character you were introduced to, you're just never convinced that he would do that. And even if he decided it was a good idea, he couldn't make it work. You know,
No,
and like
I
that one
didn't
little
buy he
scene
would
he has.
stay. I didn't buy he would
No,
have stayed. I mean,
no,
at the end, I'm like, why is he
no.
staying?
And,
You know?
and that one little scene on the street he has with Cicely Scott is about that. He's
Right.
like, "Oh, give me a break. You're not gonna
Yeah.
come on." She's like,
Yeah.
"I'm not doing it. I'm smart enough. I know I'm not gonna want to go be in politics because it sucks and it's
Yeah.
lame." She's like,
Yeah.
and then in a way that's a great scene too, because it puts
It really
it
is.
makes
Yeah.
her the smarter and the more powerful character. She's like, "I figured out this is not the right answer. You're still screwing around with it and playing footsie with these asshole politicians, and waste of time." So she
Right.
just waltzes in and waltzes out and lays out the truth for him in a way that he's not listening to, but she's right. And that's one of the very few times she pops up after they go into the politicians' offices, and it's a shame because it's one of the best ways they used her character. I just would have loved a show where they would have, you know, they really could have, they've been able to empower that character in the same way because
Yeah, I
they clearly
agree.
knew how to do it.
Yeah.
They clearly knew how to do it, but it just the cover they didn't have the cover for it. They didn't have the support.
Right. Well, you know, as you said, I mean, she's in every single episode, and it's ambiguous as to exactly what her position is, but she's not like really the center of
Yeah.
any of
Yeah.
them. And ironically, in the Who Do You Kill episode, it was the woman who played the mother was Diane Sands.
Diana Sands. Yeah.
Diana Sands. She was initially supposed to play Cicely Tyson's part, and then wound up as the guest spot, and then had such a great part in that one
Yeah.
episode, which was better than
Yeah.
you know the 26
I mean-
that Cicely Tyson was in.
I mean, I don't know if they fired her or if she just figured out that she was going to get stuck in a thankless part.
Right.
She was
right.
kind of a star. I mean, she was a star in the theater. She'd been in A Raisin in the Sun. She probably thought of herself as someone who might break through as a film star, even though ultimately she didn't. She died young. But at that point in her career, I could see her saying, "Oh, they're going to make me the secretary, and this is a bad move."
I can see. Yeah.
Also possible the network wanted to replace her, or Susskind or someone wanted to replace her. But I think, I mean, to be very blunt, I feel like the network, if it was the network's decision, they would not replace a relatively light-skinned black actor with a very dark-skinned black actor, because that was the level, that was how racism worked at that point, where just the fact that Cicely Tyson had an afro and she was very dark was a bigger deal for them to have to feel like they had to smooth over than, you know, someone who was potentially biracial or what. So I feel like probably Sansa, and she was right. You know, she ended up having a great part in Who Do You Kill rather than a thankless part in all the other episodes.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, her performance, you know, is stunning. I mean, particularly towards the end when, you know, as you said, they're living in the slums. You know, a rat gets in and bites the baby, and the baby dies. And you know, everyone is trying to help, but no one. What can anyone, including Scott, that he tries to get him a job, and you see all the discrimination. Well, you know, because he's black, he can't get into the certain unions and certain jobs. And I thought, you know, she was such her character was always so positive and upbeat, and kind of helped out her husband, who was always so, you know, and you can understand why he was so angry because of all the prejudice experiences. And then it sort of, now she, you know, as the child dies, she is now, the life is sucked out of her. And I thought, you know, as the preacher's giving all this kind of advice towards the end, the camera just stays on her, and she looks like she's gonna pop. I mean, she's trying to just hold. It's a stunning display of acting. I mean, her and oh my god, I don't know why his name is escaping me. He's such a great actor.
James Earl Jones.
Of course, James Earl Jones. And he's having a similar emotional response where they're just so sick of hearing these words. Like, it's like, can someone do some,
it wouldn't surprise me if his performance was the third rail for that show, was what really got it canceled. Because I mean, the cop out for that script would have been to emphasize their suffering, would have been to show them as victims, but essentially passive and accepting. But he's angry. I mean,
yes,
let
James Earl Jones
play the anger. I mean, like, if a rat eats your baby, you're going to be really pissed off at everyone, and you're going to lose it. And they let him do that. And so you have this hour of watching an angry black man in prime time, and that just, that was the thing. You just did that. Was you could not. That again was the kind of prejudice. Was that
yes, you can't
there
do
are
that.
all kinds of there's this gradually expanding list of acceptable depictions in mainstream culture for people of color, and really mad at the system and seeming like you're about to do something about it was at the bottom. That was the last thing. You didn't start seeing that until the 70s, and even then it's fraught. I mean, that's just an incredibly moving thing to me, to see someone expressing that, just to have the write a character who's expressing that. Why are you people making my life so miserable? It's not abstract. It's very in the moment. You really see him just like, I don't deserve that. Like, why is the why
it's hard to watch. It's really, I mean, it really is, I was having such a visceral experience watching it again. And even all the episodes, and most of them, but even Nothing But the Half Truth. I mean, just the struggles that all these characters have, like, and they're hitting these walls again and again. It's really, really powerful material. Was it difficult to get in touch with so many of the people you talked to, or how did that go?
Well, I mean, difficult in the sense that there was barely an internet when I was doing
that. That's what
yes and no. There were people I never got to, like Melnick. I kind of flirted with his, not in the literal sense. I kind of went back and forth with his assistant at the time and never made that connection. Daniel Melnick, the suit who came in as an executive on the show after Paramount bought a piece of Suskind's company, and probably ended up helping to do the network's bidding in forcing the changes, changes. He was certainly a suit, even much more than Suskind, who was a little bit of a fighter against the system. Melnick was just a suit. He was alive at the time. I never talked to him. Suskind was dead. I mean, I never tracked down Lampell, Melody Lampell. I could not get Cicely Tyson to talk to me.
Yeah, I was gonna ask. Yeah, did she get an answer, or
I didn't get a no, but I just never got a yes.
Okay.
I don't know if I never got through to her, or if she just didn't talk to me. I mean, she was, by that time she was a big star, and I think also prima donna might not be the wrong word. I mean, she was, deserving of all the accolades, but she was a big deal when I was doing that research. As Suskind's biographer, there's a great biography of David Susskind that gets into the show a little bit. He talked to her, so he actually quotes her, I think, on East Side, West Side. So at least Stephen Battaglio, that's his name, did get her take on it. But those were the big ones that I didn't get to. And then, the other one, the one I still kick myself on was like John Barry, the Blacklisted director who directed a couple of episodes. He was still alive. And he was living in he was an expat. He lived in Paris. For some reason, just picking up the phone and dialing Paris instead of dialing someone in Los Angeles was a barrier for me, and I just never quite got around to it. And I felt stupid. I feel stupid now. Like, why didn't I cold call this guy? Like, I even speak enough French to get it to the point where we were speaking English. So that was stupid. I don't know why I didn't do that. And Jones, I don't even know if I ever approached James Earl Jones. I mean, my general rule is, you're not going to get much from a one-off guest star, but in that case, that would have been an exception. And I may have been too intimidated to approach him I don't know. But I never talked to him about it. but a lot of the rank and file people who worked on it, I talked to, and they all had, everybody I did get on the phone except Scott, because he was not in good shape at that time, had a ton of stories, and they remembered a lot from it. You know, it
Yeah.
was a big deal. Whether it was a
Yeah.
high or low, it was a big deal in their career, and it was such a uh, uh, difficult production that they all remembered it in a lot of detail.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they all just had great stories. And Alan Sloan in particular, it was a very emotional thing for him, and he was quite frail at the time, and did not frail in a way he didn't really feel comfortable talking on the phone. So he sent me a bunch of letters.
Oh.
He sent me a bunch of letters that I quoted from, and those were
Oh.
amazing
Okay.
documents. And he'd also retained a copy of the "fuck you" memo that he wrote to Susskind and Company when at some point when they sold out. I forget what the inciting incident was, but there was a point where it was clear that they were caving into the pressure, and he sent them this great screed of like, you guys are sellouts, and it's unforgivable, and here's how you're betraying your art and the world and everything. And it was just this great like 3-page rant, and he had kept a copy and he sent me that, and I don't know if I quoted it or summarized it, but that was a great source. And um, uh, Susskind's papers and a lot of the writers' papers are at Wisconsin or at University of Wisconsin, and they sent me copies of a few things, but I could probably rewrite that whole thing if I did a deep dive. I had time to go out there and do a deep dive into the archives,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and it would probably answer some of the questions that I don't know the answer to. Maybe someday I'll get a chance to do that. But I don't know. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Yeah, no. I mean, but you certainly talk to enough people that it's a really, engaging, well thought out, detailed article about the making of this show. Like, so I'll leave the link in the description box below for anyone who's interested in reading it, because it's really, really wonderful. You and Happy just
They're all
last
dead now. I think every source
Yeah,
in that story.
I was wondering that. Yeah. Yeah.
Linden Chiles, the guy who played the congressman
Yes, he
in
passed
the
away
last
recently.
episodes,
Right.
he
Yeah.
fell off his roof. He fell off his roof.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
Fell off his roof and died. Yeah, like
Yeah.
5-6 years ago. Yeah, he was a good good interview. I wish someone, if he lived a little bit longer, probably would have gone back and tried to do a longer interview with him.
Right.
Interesting actor. Had an interesting career as a working actor. Always a welcome presence. Did not become a star, but yeah.
Obviously, I hate to suggest people, check out bootlegs, but it's really the only way to see this show. Like I saw it on YouTube, like it's some it's some bootleg copy that someone put up on YouTube, but it's really it's really the only way to see it. And someone I know has it on DVD. I don't know if that's also like a bootleg.
No, that's not. Yeah, those are bootlegs. That's
has there ever been any kind of way to restore it? Has anyone shown any interest in that?
I mean, that's gotten floated a few times. I've heard about it. Like somebody from Suskind's Company, I think, contacted me this year about it, or last year, and I didn't get the email. It went to the spam filter from the website account. I didn't see that email for like weeks after he sent it, and when I wrote back, I never got a reply. But it sounded like they might have been like poking that there too.
Okay.
I think I mean, it's a hard sell commercially. Like the Defenders, they released the first season like only about 5 years ago, and it didn't sell, and they didn't release the rest of it. So a lot of those are not available. Not even available as bootlegs, because that show's never even run anywhere. At least East Side West Side ran on some obscure cable channel.
Yes, yeah.
The early 2000s, and that's where all the bootlegs are. So at least you can see all of the episodes on YouTube, even though they look like crap.
Right.
It would be nice to get an upgrade. I know what I can tell you is that I think it's probably a split ownership issue or a nobody knows who owns it issue, because at the outset it was a co-production between United Artists, which is now owned by MGM, and David Susskind's company, Talent Associates, which was bought by HBO, which was bought by Warner's. And then midway through the run of the show, Paramount bought a half interest in Susskind's company. So I feel like the elements and or the rights could reside with any of those three entities or a combination of them. And it's possible that none of the parties have untangled that or have even bothered to try because
I see.
cares. I do know that when it ran on Trio, they got those tape masters. I'm not going to tell you how I know this, but I know it. They got those tape masters from MGM. So, which was this again the successor to United Artists. So I think that means that United Artists had the syndication right, retained the syndication rights to the show. Whether they own all the rights, I don't know. But at some point they transferred it to tape, and those kind of washed out looking copies that you see on YouTube are from those tape masters. A few of them had circulated, I think, from some earlier run. Like when I wrote that article, I'd only seen 14 of the 12 episodes because that was all that was around in terms of bootleg.
Oh,
in the late 90s.
oh, I
And
see.
those had been recorded off of some other TV airing in the 80s that I'm not even sure I knew where it was from. And then Trio ran them all in like 2003, 2004. And they at least sourced the elements from MGM. So MGM may own it, or they may think that, or the other Warners or Paramount may own it. And none of them may know. I don't know how far anyone has ever gotten to trying to do a home video release.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I hope it happens someday. And anyone at Paramount or MGM, I encourage you to do it because it's such a great show. It needs a really good Blu-ray release. Some restoration would be, it's fantastic. But as you said, at least in the meantime, people can see it, and I'll leave the links in the description box below if you want to check it out or check it out again. As well as Steven's great article on his website. I'll leave that in the description box below as well. Well, Steven, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate that you took the time to discuss this fantastic show with me.
I loved it. It was a fun conversation, and we were going to do deep dives on those two episodes, and we touched on them, and we didn't even go all that. I feel like I feel like there's so much material with East Side, West Side. You could do another one of these. You could do a spin-off. You could just
you really could. Well, it was something I've been thinking about doing. So if you're interested, I'll have you back sometime, and we'll discuss it some more.
we can, yeah. Or you know what you do? You get James Earl Jones on the horn, or you get Alan Arkin.
That's a good idea.
One of the handful of survivors, and get them on to talk to see what they remember about it.
Yeah, well, you know what? It's worth a shot. So I think I'll do that. And where's the best place for? Because I know you're on Twitter, so is that the best place for people to follow you? Smiling Cobra.
Probably, yeah, publicly, yeah, at Smiling Cobra, yeah. That was we alluded to this, but I don't know that we really explained it. That was the nickname that attached itself to James Aubrey, the CBS executive who ultimately, as the name suggests, put the knife into East Side, West Side, and it was just even by the standards of high-level television executives, was notoriously ruthless and two-faced and untrustworthy. So
right.
So the villain of my piece. Why I took that as my handle rather than a likable character, I will leave to my
well, it's a cool name. So
it was a cool nickname. Yeah, he was evil and he got a cool nickname. It's not fair.
Well, I'll leave the link in the description box below again, where you can follow Steven and of course to his great website, classictvhistory.com. I'll leave that in the description box below as well. So Steven, thanks again. And let's do it again sometime for sure.
Definitely. All right.
Thank you so much, everyone, for watching and or listening. If you are currently listening to this on the audio version of my YouTube channel and you've run out of episodes to listen to, head over to the YouTube channel where every single episode that I have ever recorded can be found, youtube.com/Robert Bellissimo at the movies. I also want to thank all of my members on Patreon. If you're interested in becoming a member of my Patreon, head over to the link, patreon.com/Robert Bellissimo at the movies for full details. Patreon is bonus content that I create month in and month out. And it is based on polls that I put out at the beginning of every single month, which as a member, you will have access to vote on, Just a few bucks a month goes a long way, and you'll really help the film podcast keep going here on YouTube. So head over to the link for full details. You can also leave a donation to the YouTube channel directly. If you look underneath the video box here and hit the like, comment, dislike button, there will be a button there that says thanks. Click on the thanks tab there. And from there, if you wish, you can leave a donation. And lastly, if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing by pressing the Robert Bellissimo at the Movies logo. It is absolutely free to do so. You will see it floating above my head in the top left corner to your top left in just a second. Just click on that and then click the bell in order to get a notification every time I release one of my new episodes or when I go live. Thank you so much, everyone. I will see you in the next episode.